There are two phrases that in particular bug me in academia and related professions over and over again. The first one I've already covered in this Hacking Academia video series, and that's the phrase, I have to. I have to get this done. I can't go out with my friends because I have to do this. And I pointed out the obvious, which is you almost never have to do something. You might estimate that there are bad consequences if you don't do something and hence want to avoid those bad consequences. But you almost never have to do something. And the real damage that that phrase does is when it becomes the default that you say all of the time without ever really thinking it through. The second phrase that really bugs me and that comes up quite often in academia and again in related professions is the I don't have time phrase, or the they don't have time to do that phrase. The way in which this phrase bugs me is a little bit different to the way that the I have to phrase bugs me. And so first I'll provide a little bit of context and then I want to explain my perspective on what the phrase I don't have time really means and some of the things that it should prompt in terms of thinking, both in terms of the person making the statement, but also the people that they are interacting with, especially leaders and managers. So firstly, a little bit of profession context. So there are professions where basically people are told to do something and they do it with varying degrees of enthusiasm or reluctance. I think one of the ideals that is still somewhat in touch with reality of academia and similar professions is that people are relatively self-motivated and that at least a significant chunk of what they do on a day-to-day basis is self-driven. They're not being micromanaged to do everything on an hour-by-hour basis. And that's the context in which my comments in today's video are made. Now, what often goes wrong with the phrase, I don't have time, is that people around that person immediately dive into analyzing, why doesn't that person have time? How can we free up more time for that individual? And whilst that is a nice ideal to have, the reality of modern high-pressure professional careers is that you never have enough time to do everything that you want to do. And so it's all about prioritization. And so the phrase, I don't have time, is really telling the listener two things. One is that of all the things that that individual is prioritizing doing that day, that week, that month, or that year, they do not regard the activity they've just said no to high enough on that chain of priorities. The second thing it may also be telling the listener is that the person in question regards the proposed activity as having too high a barrier or obstacle to entry in order to carry it out, and hence will not fit into their already very busy timetable. Now, if you're a leader or a supervisor or a manager and you are trying to encourage your team members to do something new and you get this response, there's really three paths you can take. So the first path is to free up time for that individual. And whilst sometimes that will be realistic, a lot of the time you just can't do it. The second path is to try and remove or reduce the barriers or obstacles. And so that's to make the thing that is perhaps relatively daunting in the eyes of the person you're talking to, and hence is too much of an ask in terms of their already tight workload, and to reduce the amount of obstacles, the number of obstacles, and the amount of efforts required to actually have a go at doing that thing. The third thing is really ultimately a self-interest thing. So if someone says, I don't have time to do that, especially in self-driven careers where people are sort of evaluating the return on investment of various things, what that really means is that the person you're talking to does not regard this activity as having enough of a payoff. And that payoff can be all sorts of things. That payoff could be helping the organization they're a part of or helping their team members or their colleagues. The payoff could quite often be helping them in their own professional individual career. Regardless of the specific details, the perception here is that there isn't enough return on investment for that individual and hence they won't prioritize it. So what you can do is work on ways to explain or show or illustrate that what you're proposing really does indeed have a lot of value for that individual, and that even from a purely selfish, self-centered perspective, that they should definitely give it some thought, because it may actually be much more important to them once they realize what it really means than they might have initially superficially thought. Obviously, if this is a person in your team, there has to be a bit of give and take. And so if you go down the route of illustrating or explaining how potentially really useful this could be to the individual's career, what you're ultimately getting them to do is to prioritize this activity over some other activity. And so if you are their supervisor or manager, when that actually happens and they go, oh, I do have time for this, you have to be in a position where you're willing to accept the fact that some other things will inevitably be deprioritized. They're not suddenly going to become 50% more efficient at everything. And finally, this relatively sort of logical, rational approach to managing this I don't have time statement really should take into account the specific context. In high pressure careers, like in many parts of academia, often the I don't have time statement is really a precursor or a symptom of an individual or a group that is in significant stress and duress. And so if you go about trying to sort of step by step work through the process, but fundamentally something's really, really wrong, and this is just a superficial symptom of what's wrong, you really need to go into that first before you consider any of these tactics or strategies. The I don't have time statement or they don't have time statement will often be an accurate synopsis of the circumstances, and you're not always going to be able to convince the individuals involved that they should actually consider doing this new thing that you're interested in them doing. But some of the time, if you can reduce the barriers, even the perceived barriers that may not actually exist, and increase or explain the motivation for why doing this thing and making time for it may actually be very helpful, even from a self-interest perspective, you may be surprised by how often people either find the time or deliberately make time to do that thing, possibly at the cost of some other things. And so you have to be prepared for that trade-off.